In the spring of 2021, a birder named Lena Whitmore drove 4 hours north from her home in the Rogue Valley of southern Oregon to stand in a suburban park outside of Portland and stare at a small yellow bird clinging to a thistle head. She had been told about the bird by a friend who had been told about it by someone on a regional listserv who had flagged it 3 days earlier with a note that read, in its entirety, "If what you just heard makes you want to keep going, stay here." This is exactly the kind of content we make, and there is a lot more of it. Subscribe now so you do not miss what comes next. Lesser goldfinch, male, Lentz Park, confirmed before reporting to the state committee. Whitmore had confirmed it. She had photographs. The bird was undeniable. It was also, by every measure she could apply, from 40 years of birding in the Pacific Northwest, a bird that had no reasonable business being where it was. The nearest established breeding population of lesser goldfinches at that time was somewhere around 650 kilometers to the south. The bird was not a vagrant in the classic sense, a wind-blown waif pushed far outside its range by a weather event it had no mechanism to anticipate or resist. It was in good condition, actively foraging, and it was not alone. There were 3 others in the park that week, then a 5th, then a pair that investigators later identified as exhibiting what can only be described as sight fidelity. They kept coming back. They were not passing through. Whitmore filed her report with the Oregon Bird Records Committee that summer. The committee accepted it, and what the committee's acceptance represented, though no one said so in those terms at the time, was not simply the addition of a new species to the state list. It was the formal recognition that something in the distributional logic of a species that had been ecologically stable across a particular geographic range for as long as anyone had been paying careful attention was no longer holding. A line that had been functionally real for decades, a boundary encoded not in anyone's map, but in the biology of the bird itself, in its thermal tolerances and its food dependencies and its breeding requirements and the accumulated behavioral inheritance of thousands of generations of ancestors that had never needed to go further north, was dissolving. Not dramatically, not all at once, but dissolving. If you find the intersection of climate science and wildlife biology as fascinating as the rest of us do, and you've made it this far, consider subscribing. What gets explored here are exactly these kinds of stories. The ones where the range maps are being redrawn in real time by the animals themselves, and where the implications of that redrawing matter more than most people realize. The lesser goldfinch is a small bird. It is easy to underestimate precisely because of that smallness, because of the cheerful, almost decorative quality of the adult male's plumage, the brilliant lemon-yellow underparts and the black cap and the white wing patches, and, in the western subspecies that concerns us here, the black dorsal surface that makes a perched male look like something a children's book illustrator designed specifically for the purpose of being noticed and appreciated, and then moved along from. The species does not project gravitas. It is, in the way of many small finches, the kind of bird that gets noted and moved past, a background element in the painting of a California chaparral hillside or a southwestern scrubland, rather than a subject that demands sustained analytical attention. That is a mistake, and the nature of that mistake is becoming clearer as the data from the last 15 years accumulates into something that cannot be responsibly dismissed as noise. The lesser goldfinch, Spinus saltria, is a species with a range that historically extended from the southwestern United States and Pacific Coast states south through Mexico, Central America, and into the Andes of western South America. In the United States, the northern boundary of that range has, for most of the documented ornithological record, fallen somewhere in the coastal ranges and interior valleys of southern Oregon, with breeding populations in the Umpqua Valley, representing approximately the northernmost consistent presence in the western portion of its range. The range has always had some fuzziness at its northern edge. Individuals and small groups have appeared north of the Umpqua with enough regularity over the decades to populate the state records and county checklists with entries flagged as casual or rare. But the distinction between a species that occasionally produces extralimital records and a species that is actively establishing new resident populations at the northern frontier of its range is not semantic. It is biological. And what the data from the last 15 years is telling us, with increasing clarity and at an accelerating pace, is that the lesser goldfinch has crossed that line and is not coming back from it. The average northward displacement of the lesser goldfinch's breeding range across the Pacific coast states over the period from approximately 2005 to the present is, depending on the analytical method and dataset used, somewhere in the neighborhood of 350 to 437 kilometers. The range of that estimate matters and is worth dwelling on. The lower end reflects analyses built primarily on Christmas bird count data and eBird presence-absence records filtered for high-effort reporting. The upper end reflects analyses that weight the establishment of confirmed breeding evidence, specifically nests with eggs, fledglings observed being fed by adults, and the presence of family groups in late summer at the frontier positions of the expanding range. The 437-kilometer figure comes from work published out of a collaboration between researchers at the University of Oregon and a consortium of Pacific Northwest ornithological groups that specifically tracked confirmed breeding versus casual presence, and it reflects a northward displacement of the established breeding edge rather than simply the northernmost point at which a single individual has been observed. That distinction matters enormously. Vagrant individuals can appear almost anywhere. Breeding populations require something different. They require habitat that meets a specific and non-trivial set of requirements across an entire annual cycle, from nest site selection and clutch incubation through fledgling development and post-breeding dispersal and winter survival. When a species establishes breeding populations at a location 437 kilometers north of where its breeding range sat 2 decades ago, it is not doing so because of a run of lucky weather or an unusual concentration of favorable microhabitat. It is doing so because the conditions across that landscape have shifted enough to make year-round residency and successful reproduction not just possible, but repeatable. Understanding what is driving this requires understanding what the lesser goldfinch actually needs, which requires stepping back from the bird as a colorful ornament and looking at it as an ecological entity with specific dependencies and specific tolerances. The lesser goldfinch is a specialist in a way that is easily missed because its prey base, seeds, appears superficially simple and abundant. It is not simple. The lesser goldfinch feeds predominantly on the seeds of plants in the family Asteraceae, the composites, which include thistles, groundsels, ragworts, dandelions, and a variety of other species that are collectively well represented across disturbed and early successional habitats. In its historical range, the bird's annual cycle tracks the phenology of this seed production with considerable precision. Breeding is timed so that the most energy-intensive period of the reproductive cycle, the feeding of rapidly growing nestlings and fledglings, coincides with peak seed availability. The bird's social structure during the non-breeding season, the loose flocks that move across the landscape following productive patches of seeding plants, reflects the same dependency. Understanding the lesser goldfinch's range limits, therefore, requires understanding not just whether the bird can survive winter temperatures at a given latitude, but whether the phenological relationships between its needs and its food sources remain coherent across the annual cycle at that latitude. This is where the climate signal enters the analysis. and where the lesser goldfinch's northward movement becomes a window into something much larger than the distributional history of a single species. The Pacific Northwest, specifically the Western Lowland Corridor that runs from the Willamette Valley of Oregon north through the Puget Sound Basin of Washington, has warmed measurably and in specific ways over the past 4 decades. The warming is not uniform across seasons or metrics. The most ecologically significant changes are not in mean annual temperature, but in the specific thermal parameters that control biological processes with the greatest sensitivity. Winter minimum temperatures, specifically the frequency and severity of hard freezes that drive the physiological stress responses in both plants and animals, have shifted substantially in the lowland Pacific Northwest. The last frost date has moved earlier in spring. The first frost date has moved later in fall. The cumulative degree days available for plant growth and seed production across the lowland Western Pacific Northwest have increased enough to expand the potential growing window for the Asteraceae species that lesser goldfinches depend on into areas where that window was previously too short or too frost-interrupted to support the kind of sustained seed production that a resident goldfinch population requires. Simultaneously, the urban heat island effect across the rapidly expanding metropolitan areas of the Willamette Valley and Puget Sound Basin has created localized thermal environments that are meaningfully warmer than their surrounding rural landscapes. Portland, Salem, Eugene, Corvallis, Olympia, Tacoma, Seattle, and the dozens of suburban municipalities that connect them represent a nearly continuous corridor of thermally moderated, heavily planted, disturbance-maintained habitat that runs along the western slope of the Cascades, from the Umpqua Valley to the Canadian border. The plants that dominate the disturbed and ornamental landscapes of these cities, the thistles in vacant lots and freeway medians, the dandelions and ragworts in unmown corners of parks and school grounds, the ornamental sunflowers and coneflowers and cosmos of suburban gardens, are precisely the Asteraceae species that lesser goldfinches rely on. The urban corridor is not natural lesser goldfinch habitat in any historical sense, but it is, with increasing fidelity, functional lesser goldfinch habitat in the practical sense, that the bird is using it successfully to meet all of its biological requirements across all seasons. This is the pattern that researchers tracking the species' expansion have found most striking and most analytically significant. The new northern populations of lesser goldfinches in the Pacific Northwest are not establishing in the most pristine or structurally complex available habitats. They are establishing in cities. They are establishing in suburbs. They are establishing in the weedy margins of parking lots, and the overgrown borders of community gardens, and the blackberry-choked ravines that Portland and Seattle have preserved in their urban fabric as green infrastructure, and that function, from a goldfinch's perspective, as year-round seed banks in a thermally hospitable matrix. The urban establishment pattern is not accidental or incidental to the range expansion. It is the mechanism. The lesser goldfinch is moving north by tracking the urban corridor, using the city as a thermal refuge and a food source simultaneously, and then spreading outward into surrounding agricultural and semi-natural habitats from those urban core populations as local densities build and competitive pressure for resources increases. The eBird data, which now represents the most comprehensive observational data set available for North American bird distribution at fine spatial and temporal scales, tells this story with unusual clarity for anyone who takes the time to read it carefully. Go to the eBird range maps for lesser goldfinch and animate the temporal sequence from 2005 to the present. Watch where the observations appear. Watch what grows first. The Willamette Valley reports build slowly through the early 2000s, concentrated in the cities, with the southern cities appearing first and the observations inching north year by year. The Salem cluster appears before the Corvallis cluster. The Corvallis cluster appears before the Portland cluster. The Portland cluster, once established, expands rapidly. By the mid-2010s, the Portland metropolitan area has what can only be described as a genuine lesser goldfinch community. Multiple confirmed breeding records, winter flocks of 10 to 30 individuals at well-established feeding sites, and a pattern of seasonal presence that is categorically different from the occasional vagrant records that characterized the region in the 1990s. North of Portland, the Washington state records follow a similar sequence. Scattered observations in Clark County, just across the Columbia River from Portland, begin appearing with regularity. Then Cowlitz County, then Lewis County, then Pierce and Thurston counties, the greater Tacoma and Olympia area. Then, with a pace that has accelerated noticeably since approximately 2018, King County, which contains Seattle, and the surrounding jurisdictions of Snohomish, Kitsap, and Mason counties. The confirmation of breeding in Washington state represents one of the most significant ornithological range expansion events in the region in the last 30 years, and it has been received with a combination of excitement and careful scientific caution that reflects the legitimate complexity of interpreting range expansion in the context of observer effort increases, climate change, and habitat change occurring simultaneously. The Washington Bird Records Committee has been diligent about documenting and analyzing the pattern, and the records through the early 2020s show a progression from casual occurrence to rare but regular occurrence to locally common in specific well-studied sites that tracks almost exactly what the Oregon records showed a decade earlier. The lag between Oregon and Washington establishment follows the geography. Washington's lowland western corridor is climatically similar to Oregon's, but sits further north and at slightly higher latitude, so the thermal threshold crossing that enabled Oregon establishment happened there first and is enabling Washington establishment now. The lag is compressed relative to what climate models from 15 years ago would have predicted, which tells us something important about the pace of the change that is difficult to say plainly without sounding alarmist, but that needs to be said plainly anyway. The bird is moving faster than the models expected. The conditions enabling that movement are changing faster than the models expected. These two facts are connected, and the connection has implications that extend well beyond the distributional history of a small yellow finch. The population dynamics at the expanding range frontier are worth examining in some detail because they reveal mechanisms that are not obvious from the simple observation that birds are appearing in new places. Range expansions in birds are not, in general, the result of a mass migration of individuals from the core range into new territory. They are the result of a specific subset of behavioral phenotypes at the range edge, individuals that disperse further than the population mean, and that, critically, attempt to breed in the novel environments they encounter, rather than returning to the established range. The individuals that succeed in establishing in novel environments and reproducing there pass their dispersal tendencies and their behavioral flexibility to offspring. And those offspring, born in the novel environment, are behaviorally calibrated to it from the beginning of their lives. They do not carry a strong return imperative to a range core they have never visited. They are, in the most direct biological sense, founding a new population, and the population they found carries forward the characteristics that made establishment possible. Understanding lesser goldfinch range expansion in the Pacific Northwest, therefore, requires understanding something about the behavioral variation within the species that enables founding events. And here, the data becomes thinner and more interpretively challenging, but no less important. Lesser goldfinches show substantial individual variation in dispersal distance and in behavioral flexibility toward novel habitats and novel food sources. This is not unusual in a species that has a naturally dynamic relationship with patchy, ephemeral food resources. A bird whose food supply is the seed production of weedy annual and biennial plants in disturbed habitats has been selected across evolutionary time for the ability to move, to find new patches, to exploit new sites when established ones are depleted or competitively defended. That movement propensity, built by selection for tracking patchy resources within the historical range, turns out to be pre-adaptive for range expansion at the frontier. The same behavioral tendency that enables a lesser goldfinch in California's Central Valley to locate a productive thistle patch 15 kilometers from where it was foraging last week also enables an individual to move 100 kilometers north of its natal population and attempt to establish in a novel environment. The range expansion is, from this perspective, not a fundamentally different behavior from normal intra-range movement. It is the same behavior operating in conditions where the environmental resistance to northward movement has been reduced enough by climate change to allow establishment where establishment previously failed. The new populations in the Pacific Northwest are not simply holding. The phrasing of that statement, though accurate in the narrow sense that the populations are not declining and are not failing to reproduce, understates what the data actually shows. The populations are growing. The winter flock sizes at well-established Portland and Seattle area sites have increased year over year through the period of documentation. The number of distinct breeding sites within the Washington and Northern Oregon urbanized corridor has increased each year for at least the last 6 consecutive years of comprehensive monitoring. The rate of new site colonization, meaning the appearance of lesser goldfinches at locations where they have no prior documented presence, and their subsequent establishment of regular use and confirmed breeding, has increased rather than leveled off. A leveling off would suggest that the frontier populations have reached the northern thermal boundary, beyond which establishment is not currently possible. The continued acceleration suggests that the thermal boundary itself is still moving, and that the populations are tracking it rather than approaching a static limit. This is perhaps the most significant data point in the entire pattern, and it is the one that climate biologists working on range shift dynamics find most diagnostic. A species tracking a moving climate boundary is a species in a fundamentally different situation from a species that has reached a new stable range limit. The implications for how the next 2 decades of distributional change will unfold are different in ways that matter for management, for conservation planning, and for the broader public understanding of what is happening to the bird communities of the Pacific Northwest. The birding community in the Pacific Northwest has been tracking this story longer and with more granular attention than any other constituency, and the community's response to what it has been observing is itself worth examining as a social and cultural phenomenon. Pacific Northwest birders tend to be, as a group, serious about their data. The culture of careful documentation, of photograph-backed records, of skepticism toward unsupported claims is deep in the regional birding community. The lesser goldfinch expansion has therefore been met not with uncritical excitement, but with a rigorously documented enthusiasm that has produced, as its primary artifact, one of the most detailed regional range expansion datasets for any passerine species in North American ornithological history. The community's eBird submissions, cross-referenced with the State Records Committee files and with the research data from collaborating academic institutions, represent a scientific resource of genuine value that would not exist without the sustained collective effort of hundreds of people who went to parks and feeders and weedy lots on cold Pacific Northwest mornings with binoculars and cameras and carefully submitted what they found. The citizen science infrastructure that makes Pacific Northwest bird monitoring as robust as it is did not emerge from institutional decision-making. It emerged from decades of organized interest by people who cared about birds and built systems to document what they were seeing. That infrastructure is now capturing a range expansion event in real time, at a level of spatial and temporal resolution that would have been impossible to achieve through professional research alone. The data exists because the community existed. That is not a trivial observation. The ecological implications of the lesser goldfinch's northward expansion extend in several directions that deserve separate and careful treatment. The first and most obvious is competitive. The lesser goldfinch is not moving into an unoccupied ecological space. The Pacific Northwest already has resident goldfinch species, most notably the American goldfinch, which is common throughout the region and whose ecological role overlaps substantially with the lesser. Both species are seed specialists, with a strong preference for Asteraceae. Both form flocks outside the breeding season. Both use similar nest sites and similar nest materials. The American goldfinch and the lesser goldfinch can coexist, and they do coexist across portions of their shared range in California and southern Oregon, without apparent competitive exclusion. But coexistence is not cost-free. In areas where lesser goldfinches have established substantial populations in the Pacific Northwest, American goldfinch detection rates at sites with previously stable detection histories have shown patterns that warrant monitoring, if not alarm. Distinguishing competitive displacement from coincidental fluctuation in a bird community subject to multiple simultaneous pressures, including habitat change, weather variability, and the general turbulence of a community undergoing rapid compositional change, is methodologically difficult. The signal is not clean enough to allow confident claims about competitive interaction, but it is also not clean enough to dismiss, and the research question of how lesser goldfinch establishment is affecting American goldfinch populations in the Pacific Northwest is not one that has received the scientific attention it deserves. The second ecological implication involves the plants. Lesser goldfinches are seed predators, in the strict sense that they consume seeds without dispersing them. Their interaction with Asteraceae populations in the Pacific Northwest is therefore primarily extractive rather than mutualistic. This is not a devastating ecological impact in the context of the abundant, weedy, often introduced Asteraceae species that constitute the core of their food base in the urban and suburban matrix. Thistles and dandelions are not at risk from goldfinch seed predation. But in areas where lesser goldfinches move from urban and suburban habitat into native plant communities at the edges of their range, the interaction with native Asteraceae species, some of which are uncommon, habitat-restricted, or regionally significant as components of Pacific Northwest prairie and oak savanna ecosystems, is a less benign relationship and one that has not been systematically studied. The question of whether a new, abundant, specialist seed predator has measurable effects on native plant community composition in areas where it establishes at high densities is a legitimate research question, and the absence of data does not mean the absence of effect. The third ecological implication is perhaps the most interesting and the least discussed. The lesser goldfinch's northward movement is happening as part of a broader reorganization of the Pacific Northwest bird community that includes multiple species expanding their ranges northward simultaneously. The lesser goldfinch is not an isolated case. It is, in a sense, the most visible and most thoroughly documented representative of a pattern playing out across dozens of species in the region. California scrub jay populations have established breeding colonies well north of their historical range boundary in both Oregon and Washington. Eurasian collared doves, which are not native and which have expanded across North America from a Florida introduction with remarkable speed, have become common across the Pacific Northwest landscape in a period of just 2 decades. Anna's hummingbirds, whose range has historically been restricted to the coastal lowlands of California and Oregon, are now year-round residents across the Seattle metropolitan area, a distributional state that would have been considered essentially impossible to predict based on the thermal requirements of a hummingbird species that does not migrate. The Pacific Northwest bird community of 2024 is meaningfully different in its composition from the Pacific Northwest bird community of 2004, and that compositional change is ongoing. The lesser goldfinch is not the leading edge of a metaphorical wave, so much as it is one strand in a complex, multi-species fabric that is being rewoven by conditions changing faster than the historical record of any individual species range limit would suggest. The research framework for understanding range shifts of this kind has evolved substantially over the past 2 decades, driven by the recognition that classical range limit theory, which treated species range boundaries as equilibrium expressions of physiological tolerances, was inadequate to describe the dynamic, non-equilibrium range shifts being documented across taxa globally. The modern framework distinguishes between the proximate factors driving individual dispersal decisions and establishment attempts, the local habitat conditions that enable or prevent breeding success at novel sites, the demographic connectivity between frontier populations and source populations in the historical range, and the evolutionary dynamics of populations at expanding range edges. Each of these operates on a different timescale and through different mechanisms, and the interaction between them produces range expansion dynamics that are not predictable from any single component alone. In the lesser goldfinch case, the proximate driver of individual dispersal into the Pacific Northwest appears to be a combination of post-breeding wandering behavior, which is common in the species, and the attractive quality of the urban food resources, particularly feeder infrastructure, that Pacific Northwest birders provide in abundance. The feeders are not trivial. The density of bird feeders in Portland and Seattle neighborhoods that are actively maintained by people interested in attracting unusual species creates a food resource network that reduces the cost of establishment for a pioneering lesser goldfinch in ways that are ecologically real, but that are not typically discussed in the range expansion literature, where the focus tends to be on wild habitat rather than human-subsidized food. A male lesser goldfinch that disperses north of its historical range and finds a Niger seed feeder maintained by a birder who is delighted to have it is a male lesser goldfinch that has had a major component of its winter survival cost dramatically reduced. The feeder is not going to make a species establish where the climate genuinely cannot support it. But at the margin, in the zone where climate conditions are transitional and where the difference between survival and mortality in a hard winter may be the availability of a reliable high-calorie food source when wild seeds are depleted by ice, the feeder network across the Pacific Northwest urban corridor is a meaningful part of the story of how lesser goldfinch establishment has succeeded. This creates an interesting and not entirely comfortable dynamic for the birding community. The same people who are most excited about and most diligently documenting the lesser goldfinch's northward expansion may be, through their feeder maintenance, contributing to the rate and success of that expansion. This is not a criticism. The decision to maintain a feeder in a Pacific Northwest backyard is not ecologically wrong-headed, and the conservation calculus of feeding wild birds in urban environments is broadly positive when the practices involved are responsible. But it means that the story of the lesser goldfinch's range expansion in the Pacific Northwest is not purely a story about climate change and bird biology. It is also, at least in part, a story about human choices and human infrastructure and the complex ways that a highly engaged community of bird enthusiasts is participating, knowingly or not, in the ecological transformation it is documenting. The observer is not neutral. The observer never is. But in this case, the observer's non-neutrality is particularly legible in the data. The breeding behavior that new Pacific Northwest populations have exhibited deserves specific attention because it reveals something about the species' behavioral flexibility that was not fully appreciated from studies of populations in the historical range. Lesser goldfinches in California typically begin nesting in April or May, with a peak of nesting activity in June and a second clutch in July in many populations. In the Pacific Northwest populations, the nesting phenology has been documented at a variety of sites as running somewhat later, with peak activity shifted toward June and July and second clutch attempts extending into August. This shift is consistent with the later timing of peak Asteraceae seed production at the higher latitude sites. The birds are apparently adjusting their breeding timing to track the local phenology of their food supply rather than exhibiting the fixed timing that a purely genetically controlled breeding schedule would predict. The degree of behavioral plasticity this represents is significant. Breeding phenology in birds is typically highly conserved and under strong genetic control, because the fitness consequences of mistiming the breeding season are severe. The fact that lesser goldfinches establishing in the Pacific Northwest are showing phenological flexibility, arriving at breeding timing that is appropriate to local conditions rather than simply expressing the timing of their California source populations, suggests a degree of adaptive capacity that bodes well for the long-term viability of the new populations, but that also raises questions about the mechanisms involved. Is the phenological shift a result of individual plasticity, with individual birds modifying their behavior in response to local environmental cues? Is it a result of selection, with individuals whose phenology happens to match Pacific Northwest conditions better surviving and reproducing at higher rates and passing their timing to offspring? Is it a result of population-level learning, with birds cueing on the behavior of established conspecifics? The answer is probably some combination of all three, operating across the relatively short time span of the expansion, and the ability of the species to arrive at an appropriate breeding phenology through any of these mechanisms is itself a demonstration of the ecological flexibility that makes the range expansion possible. The nest sites being used in the Pacific Northwest populations are similarly instructive. In California, lesser goldfinches most commonly nest in the fork of a deciduous shrub or small tree, frequently in willow, cottonwood, or native shrub species at low to moderate height, typically between 1 and 4 meters above the ground. In Pacific Northwest urban and suburban populations, the documented nest sites include a broader range of tree and shrub species, including non-native ornamental species that are common in urban plantings, and a wider range of nest heights. Birches, ornamental cherries, apple trees in old orchard fragments, and even hedgerow hawthorns have been documented as nest trees at Pacific Northwest sites, where no comparable nest site use has been recorded in California populations. This expanded nest site use is not surprising in a pioneer population that is occupying novel habitat, but it confirms that the species is not limited to a narrow substrate preference that would constrain its ability to exploit the available structure of Pacific Northwest urban and suburban vegetation. The social dynamics of the new populations raise questions that are harder to address with existing data, but that are consequential for understanding the long-term trajectory of the expansion. Range-expanding populations typically begin as small founding groups, with limited genetic diversity, a consequence of the bottleneck created when a small number of dispersing individuals from the source population establish in novel habitat. The genetic consequences of founding bottlenecks in bird populations can be significant, reducing the adaptive potential of the founding population and potentially creating demographic fragility if the founding group is small enough. In the lesser goldfinch case, the genetic architecture of the Pacific Northwest populations has not been systematically characterized, which means the degree to which they represent genetically distinct founding groups versus populations maintained by ongoing gene flow from the California source population is not known. The behavioral evidence is mixed. The year-round residency that has been documented at several Pacific Northwest sites suggests that at least some individuals are not undertaking the long-distance movements that would maintain genetic connectivity with southern populations. But the winter eruptions that have brought large numbers of individuals into the region in some years suggest that connectivity is not completely severed. The genetic question matters because it determines whether the Pacific Northwest populations are developing the evolutionary independence needed to adapt to local conditions, or whether they are dependent on continuing immigration from the south to maintain their demographic viability. The answer will determine, in part, how robust the new populations are to the kind of extreme weather events, prolonged winter cold snaps, seed crop failures, that periodically stress bird populations in the Pacific Northwest and that represent the most immediate threat to newly established frontier populations of a species that has historically experienced milder winters. The extreme weather question is the one that produces the most honest uncertainty in the conversations among ornithologists who have been watching the lesser goldfinch expansion closely. The winters of the Pacific Northwest lowlands are, in general, mild by the standards of the continental interior. Portland and Seattle rarely experience extended periods of temperatures below -10°C at low elevations, and when such events occur, they are typically brief, but they do occur. The winter of 2008 to 2009 brought an unusual cold event to the Pacific Northwest lowlands that produced measurable mortality in some wintering bird populations. The winter of 2021 to 2022 brought a cold snap in December that pushed temperatures in Portland to the lowest recorded in decades for that month. In both events, the lesser goldfinch populations in the region were smaller and less established than they are now, so the direct impact on the new populations was not well documented. But the vulnerability is real. A species that is living at the northern edge of its thermal tolerance, in a newly colonized range that has not been occupied long enough for local adaptations to accumulate, is a species that carries a meaningful cold event vulnerability that its core range counterparts do not share. If a sufficiently severe and prolonged winter event were to hit the Pacific Northwest lowlands, the lesser goldfinch populations in the region could decline dramatically in a short time period. Whether they would recover from such a decline would depend on the same factors that enabled the initial establishment: the pace of northward dispersal from source populations to the south, the availability of suitable habitat in the affected areas, and the degree to which the warming trend that enabled establishment in the first place continues to make the Pacific Northwest lowlands suitable for year-round occupancy. The climate projections for the Pacific Northwest are, on this specific question, relatively consistent across models. The lowland western Pacific Northwest is projected to continue warming, with continued upward pressure on minimum winter temperatures, continued reduction in the frequency and severity of hard freezes at low elevations, and continued lengthening of the growing season. Under all but the most optimistic emission scenarios, the thermal conditions that have enabled lesser goldfinch establishment in the Pacific Northwest are projected to become more rather than less permissive over the coming decades. The establishment that has occurred so far, in other words, is not a temporary aberration driven by a run of unusually mild winters that will eventually be reversed. It is an early expression of a directional shift in the climatic conditions of the region that is projected to continue and intensify. The lesser goldfinch is not at the northern frontier of its range because the climate temporarily allowed it to be there. It is there because the climate has fundamentally changed enough to make the Pacific Northwest a viable part of its permanent range, and the change is ongoing. The bird is following a condition that is not going to stop moving. The management and conservation implications of this reality are complex and in some cases uncomfortable for institutions whose planning frameworks were built on the assumption of relatively stable species distribution maps. The lesser goldfinch is not a species of conservation concern in its historical range. It is common across California, abundant in parts of the Southwest, and does not appear on any state or federal threatened or endangered list. The attention it receives from conservation institutions is therefore minimal relative to its ecological significance in a rapidly changing regional context. But the expanding Pacific Northwest populations represent something that existing conservation frameworks are not designed to easily accommodate. A species that is actively establishing new range is doing so in direct response to climate-driven habitat change, and that is colonizing a region where the existing ecology was not configured to include it. The questions that framework needs to answer, whether and how to protect newly established breeding sites for a non-threatened species, whether to monitor competitive interactions with resident species, whether to manage habitat in ways that facilitate or constrain the expansion, are not questions that existing endangered species or game bird management protocols are designed to address. The Wildlife Society's working groups on climate-driven range shifts have flagged this institutional gap as one of the more pressing governance challenges in conservation biology, and the lesser goldfinch is a reasonable illustrative example of the broader problem. The species is not the only one facing this situation. It is one of dozens of species for which the question of whether to facilitate, monitor, manage, or in some cases resist northward range expansion is not currently governed by any coherent institutional framework. Some of the species undergoing similar expansions are benign additions to Pacific Northwest bird communities. Some may be genuinely problematic as competitors, disease vectors, or disruptors of native community structure. The lesser goldfinch appears to fall closer to the benign end of that spectrum, but the assessment is based on limited data and a time span of establishment too short to reveal slower developing impacts. The institutional response to the expansion, which has been primarily one of documentation and fascination rather than management, may be entirely appropriate. Or it may reflect an absence of framework rather than a considered decision. That absence of management is the right response. The difference between those two things is important and has not been clearly established. The people most directly engaged with the lesser goldfinch populations in the Pacific Northwest, the birders and naturalists and community scientists who are maintaining feeders, submitting eBird checklists, photographing nests, and recording breeding behavior at frontier sites, are performing a function that the institutional framework has not adequately recognized or supported. They are generating the data on which any future management decision would need to be based. They are doing this without institutional direction, without significant financial support, and with a dedication that is driven entirely by genuine interest in the natural world and a sense of shared responsibility for documenting what is happening to it. The Oregon and Washington birding communities have produced, through their collective effort, a range expansion dataset for the lesser goldfinch that is substantially better than what equivalent professional research programs would have generated with the funding available for a non-threatened species of this kind. That outcome represents both a triumph of community science and an indictment of an institutional framework that systematically underinvests in the documentation of ecological change happening below the threshold of conservation emergency. The lesser goldfinch is one thread in a fabric that is being rewoven faster than most people are aware. Pacific Northwest bird communities are undergoing a compositional shift that is visible in the data, legible to anyone who spends time in the field with a good ear and a current field guide, and deeply significant for the long-term trajectory of bird diversity in one of the most ecologically important regions in North America. Species are moving north. The speed of that movement is tracking, with uncomfortable accuracy, the speed of climate change. The range maps in field guides published 10 years ago are already partially obsolete. The maps that will be published 10 years from now, if they are written honestly from current trend data rather than from historical range descriptions adjusted conservatively, will be dramatically different from anything that would have been considered credible in 2005. The birds are telling us something. They are telling it through their presence in places where they have never been before, through their nests in trees they have never nested in before, through their calls heard on mornings in cities that their parents and grandparents never visited. The message is not subtle. It is printed in yellow and black on every thistle head where a male lesser goldfinch is clinging and singing in a Portland park in June. What it says, for anyone paying attention, is that the world has changed and is still changing, and that the change has consequences visible in real time in the birds above our heads, if we bother to look up and know what we are seeing. Lena Whitmore drove home from that Portland park in 2021 with her photographs and her confirmed record, and something else that she described to a friend. Later, as a feeling she did not have a clean name for, something between excitement and unease. The bird was extraordinary. The bird was where it should not have been. By any measure, she had built her understanding of Pacific Northwest birds on over 40 years of paying careful attention. And it was going to keep being there. And it was going to be joined by others. And the world in which the lesser goldfinch did not belong in Portland was receding behind her, in the rearview mirror, at a speed that no one who had been birding in that region 20 years ago would have predicted, and that everyone who is birding there now is watching happen whether or not they have found words for what it means. The bird is here. The conditions that brought it here are not going to reverse. The question is, what comes next? For the bird and for the communities, human and ecological, that are now learning to share a landscape with it. That question does not have a comfortable answer. The comfortable answer would be that the lesser goldfinch's expansion is simply a charming addition to the Pacific Northwest's bird life, evidence of nature's resilience in the face of change, a feel-good story in a news environment hungry for them. There is genuine truth in that framing. The lesser goldfinch is a beautiful bird. Its establishment in the Pacific Northwest is, at the level of individual observation, a delightful thing. But the driver of its establishment is not delightful, and the lesser goldfinch is not establishing in isolation. It is establishing as part of a reorganization of the natural world that includes losses as well as gains, that is disrupting ecological relationships built over millennia in a time span measured in decades, and that is producing a future that is genuinely uncertain in ways that the comfortable feel-good story does not accommodate. The honest version of what is happening to lesser goldfinches and to the Pacific Northwest bird community, more broadly, requires holding both things simultaneously. The birds are remarkable. The conditions producing the changes in their distribution are alarming. The documentation is important. The institutional response has been inadequate. The community doing the watching has been indispensable. The future is genuinely unclear. All of those things are true at the same time, and treating any one of them as the whole story is a way of not seeing what is actually in front of you when you raise your binoculars and focus on a small yellow bird in a thistle patch in a city that was not, by any prior logic, supposed to have one.